Have you ever wondered what happens to a person at the moment of death? Not 10 minutes later. Not an hour later. But at the very second when the heart stops, the breath breaks off, and silence falls. What if behind that silence hides not emptiness, but something much greater? Perhaps the answers to the questions humanity has been asking since the beginning: is there life after death? Does heaven exist? And is it true that everything must be paid for? Charlotte Holmes, a woman who happened to experience what many don't even dare to imagine. Not a celebrity, not a medium, not a writer in search of sensation. She was an ordinary American, a wife, a mother, a grandmother. And on the day her heart stopped, she had no idea she was about to pass through the veil separating the living and those who are gone. It happened in a clinic. She had been brought in for a heart examination. A routine procedure. The doctor said to wait a little. We'll check your blood pressure, look at your vessels. But literally within a few minutes, everything went wrong. Charlotte's blood oxygen level began to drop rapidly. Her blood pressure collapsed. Alarm numbers flashed on the monitor. Within a few seconds, her heart stopped. Technically, it was death. The doctors fought for her. But while they were injecting medications and activating the defibrillator, something was happening to Charlotte that defied scientific explanation. She recalls, I felt myself leaving my body. No pain, no fear. Only peace. And I was rising upward, like air. I saw myself lying on the hospital bed, with tubes and monitors. And around me, doctors, nurses, commotion. But I was no longer a part of it. What was it? A glitch of the brain? A dying mind's illusion? Or something more? It was at that moment Charlotte saw something she would remember for the rest of her life. She found herself in a place she calls heaven. There were no buildings or streets like we know. Everything looked like a painting, but more alive than life itself. A bright light that didn't blind but warmed. The air like music. And most importantly, people. People she knew. But they were younger. Brighter. And they smiled. Her mother. Her father. Relatives who had long since passed. They stood and waited for her, as if they knew she was coming. Sounds like a fairy tale? But she wasn't seeking fame. Didn't write books. Didn't try to monetize her experience. She simply told her truth. And in her voice there was no sensation, but some kind of simple and honest faith. And then the strangest part begins. Because her path didn't end in that heaven. As soon as she realized that this place truly existed, everything suddenly changed. The light disappeared. Everything that surrounded Charlotte, the beautiful landscape, the smiling faces, the feeling of peace in an instant turned into something completely opposite. She seemed to fall. Or someone was pulling her down, to a place where there was no sun, where the air became thick like smoke and seemed poisoned with fear. I smelled it, she recalls, it was awful. It was something between rotting meat, burning, and something inhuman. I didn't even know such smells existed. Before her, an abyss opened. Not metaphorical, but literal, a gaping darkness from which sounds emerged. First whispers. Then screams. They grew louder, turned into cries. She saw no faces, but she felt pain. The pain of others. And horror. People or beings that were once people were screaming not from fear, but from realization. The realization of something terrible. Something with no escape. You might be thinking, well, a typical image of hell. But there is no fire here, and no pitchforks. Here, darkness, loneliness, and an eternity without hope. Charlotte didn't just see it. She felt it, as if her soul for a moment had been on the other side. And only one question echoed in her mind: why are they showing me this? The answer came from somewhere within. Without words. Without a voice. Just knowledge, so you can tell others. So they know. Then it all stopped. She woke up in the hospital room. Doctors stood over her. One of them held her hand and repeated, "You're with us. You're back with us." For those around her, only a few minutes had passed. But for Charlotte it had been an eternity. It could have been written off as hallucinations, as chemical processes in the brain at the moment of death. But her account matches dozens, maybe hundreds, of others. People who've experienced clinical death describe similar visions. Light. Loved ones. Silence. Then darkness. Horror. And return. But what stands out is this: Charlotte changed. After that experience, she became someone else. Calmer. Wiser. As if she saw something a human isn't yet meant to see and came back to warn us. She began to speak. Not shouting, not scaring, but speaking gently, yet firmly. She didn't demand belief. She only asked people to think. "You live as if eternity lies ahead," she said in one interview. But what if eternity is already near, and it depends on how you live today? Have you ever thought about that? About what comes after? And if you have, are you ready to hear what happened next with Charlotte? Because what she saw after calls into question everything we've come to believe. After Charlotte came back to life, something inside her broke, or, on the contrary, was restored. The doctors were astonished. They had expected serious consequences, brain damage, at the very least confusion. But the woman who had experienced clinical death spoke clearly. She looked people straight in the eyes. And most importantly, in her gaze there was a strange, quiet certainty. As if she knew something we didn't. Days passed, then weeks. Charlotte returned home. But from that moment on, she began to have dreams. Not ordinary ones, but a continuation of what had begun there, beyond the veil. In her dreams came those she had seen in heaven: her mother, father, grandmother. They said nothing. Just looked at her. Sometimes they pointed to something behind her. She would turn and wake up in a cold sweat. And then the voices. Not out loud. Somewhere inside. Whispers, like the echo of thoughts. They didn't frighten her, but made her alert. One in particular: "You must tell. Before it's too late." It repeated again and again. Gently, but distinctly. One day she couldn't take it anymore and went to church. Before that, she admits, she had only been a believer in a formal sense. Like many, she knew that God existed, but didn't think much about it. She told the priest her story. Thought he would doubt her. But he simply nodded. "You were not the first. But you were one of the few who understood." Understood what? Here's where it gets most interesting. Because after that, Charlotte began to notice things. Strange coincidences. Encounters with people who said just the right words. Events, as if guided by someone from above. The puzzle was coming together. She understood. She was brought back not by accident. And not just as a witness, but as a guide. She had to speak. To warn. What I saw is real. Not a symbol, not a metaphor. That place exists. And what I saw down below exists too. It's not a myth. Not a fairy tale. I felt it with every cell of my soul. When people asked her what exactly she had understood, Charlotte would answer, "We are all at a crossroads. Every day. Our choices are not just moral. They are navigation. Toward the light or into the darkness. And if only you could see what awaits at the end, you would reconsider every word, every action. It didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a plea. She didn't write a book. Didn't appear on television. But her story spread. Someone recorded the conversation, someone told a friend. And soon dozens of people across different states in America were talking about it. About the woman who had been there and came back. And the more people heard her story, the more they began to remember their own dreams. Their own moments, when something seemed to call them to reflect. To stop. To change. But the most mysterious part was still ahead. Because a few months after her return, Charlotte saw a sign. And according to her, it was a warning for all of us. It happened early in the morning. The day began as usual: coffee, silence, the singing of birds outside the window. But suddenly, right in the middle of the room, a light flared up in the air, not from a lamp, not from the sun. Just light. It was warm, soft, almost invisible. And along with it a feeling. Foreign, yet familiar. As if someone was standing nearby. Someone invisible, but real. Charlotte froze. She felt tightness in her chest, not from fear, but from awe. As if something sacred had touched her soul. And in that very second, she understood it was a sign. They were speaking to her again. Showing. Reminding, time is passing. And we have less and less of it. They made me understand, she said later, that humanity has come to the edge. People have become too absorbed in themselves. In money. In convenience. But they forgot the most important thing: why we live at all. You might be thinking now, this sounds like a religious sermon. And you would have every right to think so. But Charlotte never preached. She shared. Silently. Through looks. Through simple words. Through presence. You just wanted to be near her. Because something emanated from her, something the world lacked: a silence in which truth could be heard. From that moment on, she began to change even more. She quit television, deleted herself from social media. Moved to a small house in the countryside. Not out of fear. Out of choice. Silence, she said, is the language of God. And in the noise, you can't hear him. And then the visits began. People started coming to her. Some had heard from friends, some stumbled upon an interview. They drove hundreds of miles to ask one single question: what now? What do we do if all of this is true? And she answered not with systems or doctrines. She simply asked, stop. Look at your life. What in it is real? Who do you love? What do you wake up for in the morning? If you had only one day left to live, what would you say? What would you change? Many cried. Some were silent. Some left and later wrote her letters: I changed everything. Thanks to you. But with each visit, she felt a strange tension growing inside. As if time was running out. As if there, on the other side, they were waiting. And the reminder became ever clearer: you've shown them. Now it's up to them. One night she dreamed of that same darkness. The abyss. The whispers. The screams. All that she had already seen. Only this time, she heard names. Not strangers. Familiar ones. Those she had met, those who had come to her. She awoke in terror. But it wasn't fear for herself. It was a warning. In that moment, she understood, the responsibility was no longer hers alone. Because everyone who had heard her story could no longer say, I didn't know. And this is no longer a story about a woman who survived death. This is a story about you. About me. About each of us. But there is still something Charlotte never told anyone. Not her husband. Not her children. Not even the priest. A secret she would have taken with her, if not for that final visit. It was late autumn. In the evening, when the day dies slowly, and the air smells of fallen leaves, smoke, and silence. Charlotte sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket, as she did every evening. Everything was as usual, tea, the old Bible on her lap, silence. But suddenly a knock on the door. No doorbell, no warning. Just a quiet, polite, but somehow too precise knock. She stood up, walked slowly to the door, and opened it. A man was standing on the porch. Around 40 years old. Gray at the temples, a dark coat, a gaze calm, but too direct. As if he could see right through her. "Charlotte Holmes?" he asked, as if he had no doubt. "Yes," she replied slowly. "Do we know each other?" "Not yet. But I was told you have something to show me." She didn't understand who they were. But in that moment, her chest turned cold. Like that time, the second when she had first left. And she understood this wasn't just a man. Or not entirely a man. He didn't come by accident. He knew. He was part of it all. He didn't introduce himself. Didn't sit down. Didn't talk about himself. He just stood. And waited. And she understood. For the first time in all this time, she knew the moment had come to reveal the most important thing. The thing she had kept inside, afraid to voice. Because even the most faithful, even the most sensitive, weren't ready for it. She began to speak. Not loudly. Not with pathos. Just to speak. As if someone was dictating to her from within. She said that there, on the other side of light and darkness, there are not just places. There are levels. Layers. Some filled with peace. Others with pain. But the most frightening thing is not that you end up there. It's why you end up there. They don't judge us the way you think, she said. Not God with a book and a pen. We judge ourselves. When you die, your whole life plays before you. Every word. Every choice. Every inaction. And there are no excuses. No, I didn't mean to, or it just happened. You know where you failed. And you choose where you go next. The darkness is not punishment. It is a reflection of what you were hiding inside. The man listened silently. Didn't interrupt. Didn't nod. He just stood there, like a mute witness. And then she said something she had never dared to even think out loud. There are others who returned, like me. But they chose silence. Or forgot. Or were afraid. There are few of us. Very few. But our number is growing. Because the time is drawing near. Something is coming. He didn't respond. He just looked her in the eyes. Long, deeply. As if trying to see, is she lying? But then he nodded. You've done your part. Now it's their turn. He left just as quietly as he had come. And Charlotte stood for a long time at the open door, feeling how the world around her became quieter, deeper, and colder. She knew, now everything depends on those who heard her story. Who accepts it. And who rejects it. Because the time she spoke of has already begun. Several years have passed since then. Charlotte Holmes disappeared from the public eye. No more interviews. No new stories. As if she vanished. Those who tried to find her encountered silence. The house was sold. Accounts deleted. No trace. But the story remained. The one she told. The one that lived in the memory of those who had heard it. People began to share. To write. To search for one another. To form groups. Not sects, not movements. Just simple circles based on shared interest, on faith, on experience. People bound together by something invisible. Something otherworldly. And in every such story echoed Charlotte's words, choice every day. Salvation not in ritual, but in decision. And hell begins here, if you walk into it yourself. By coincidence or not, strange things began happening almost simultaneously in different parts of the country. People were having the same dreams. Words from Charlotte's dream, "You must tell," now echoed in their minds. Some claimed to have seen a man in a coat. Others felt warmth and light in the most unexpected places, in a church, on a train, in a supermarket. An inexplicable feeling as if someone was nearby and quietly saying, "The time has come." But the final chapter of this story is not about mysticism. It's about us. Charlotte is gone. But she didn't leave behind knowledge. Not a secret. She left behind a mirror. And now we, each of us, stand before it. We look. And we cannot look away. What do you see when you're alone? Without a screen, without noise, without excuses? What do you hear when the world goes still? Is there light inside you, or have you long been living in a half-shadow, convincing yourself that everything is fine? Maybe you'll never experience clinical death. Never see the garden or the stillness. Never hear voices from another world. And maybe you'll say, it's all just stories. You have the right. We are free. But if even part of this story is true, wouldn't you want to be ready? Isn't it worth reflecting on while there's still time? Because, as Charlotte said in her last letter, left tucked into an old bookmark in her Bible, they won't ask who you were. They'll ask who you became. And if you're hearing these words, maybe this is your knock on the door. Will you open it?